Everyone. Welcome to the webinar Electrification and its Impact on Local Mobility Policy. Before we dive into the topic, let me briefly introduce myself and the organization I work for. My name is Merten de Kinderen. I'm Communication Manager at Mobiel 21, a Belgian nonprofit organization that sets people in motion towards more sustainable modes of transport and travel. As part of our actions and activities, we actively build bridges between citizens and policymakers, for example, through citizen science projects, participation processes, co-creation campaigns. We also build bridges between policymakers themselves and between different levels of government, so between the local level, the national level, and the European level as well. One way of doing so is through knowledge sharing and capacity building, for example, through cvnet.be. That's a learning network within the European Civitas initiative that brings together local policymakers from Brussels, Flanders, and Wallonia to help them get a better picture of what's happening on the European level. In other words, cvnet.be brings Europe to your town hall or your village square, for example, by hosting a webinar like this one today. So participants today, therefore, mainly include Belgian policymakers and professionals, but also some people from other European countries are joining. Of course, electrification is quite a broad topic. So today I propose we break it down a bit. And I have three different speakers in store for you. First of all, there's Pedro Gomes, the Clean Vehicles and Air Quality Cluster Lead at POLIS, who will give us a broad overview of European policy trends, e-mobility challenges on the local level, and practical examples from cities and towns across Europe. Next up, we have Rosanne Vanpée. She is a researcher at Transport and Mobility Leuven, and she will zoom in on the socio-economic aspect of electrification. So the affordability of electric car use for your citizens. And then finally, my colleague Elke Francois will share with us how she, as a citizen, requested a charging point in her low-traffic street and how she experienced that whole process. In the second part of the webinar, we will open the floor to questions from the audience and encourage an open discussion about the challenges you are coping with as a city or a town. Questions that cannot be answered by the experts I've gathered here today will be picked up outside of the webinar, or they will serve as a starting point for a future subsequent webinar about the same topic. So that's the program for today. I'm not going to tell you more about this all. I propose I just close my screen and ask Pedro to share his. And Pedro, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invitation of being here today and share a bit of the experience of POLIS. I hope you can see my screen. I'm going now to put in presentation mode.
Yes, we can see it.
Great. So I will start first my presentation today with a brief overview what is POLIS network, and then I will go through some policy updates, specifically the CO2 standards for cars and heavy-duty vehicles and AFIR, which relates to the charging infrastructure. I will highlight some of the challenges that e-mobility brings for urban context, but also some opportunities. And finally, I will give some examples from cities, including research and innovation projects. So POLIS, we are a leading network of local authorities for transport innovation. At the moment, we have probably a little bit more now than 120 members. We go from big cities and capitals to small and medium-sized cities and also regions. So we have different perspectives and we cover a lot of different contexts. But then we also have research institutions that are associate members. So in Belgium, for example, we have cities like Antwerp, we have the region of Brussels, we have the region of Flanders, we have Leuven, Mechelen. So different sizes and different contexts. Unfortunately, for the moment, we don't have any city in Wallonia. Hopefully, we will be able to change that in the future. We work on 4 key pillars. One of them is the peer-to-peer exchange. So our members, what we do with them, we stimulate these exchanges like the ones that we are having today among our membership. So they all have questions how to navigate sustainable mobility, how to deal with the challenges that come from the top, which is European policy, but also from the bottom, which is the citizens' needs. And we try to help each other by exchanging best practices, what works, what doesn't work, from more advanced cities to cities that are just starting. And we try to transform that work in policy and advocacy, trying to bring the voice of the cities and the regions to the European institutions. We are based here in Brussels. So we try sometimes to to tell the Commission, the Parliament, that their top-down approach sometimes needs to be a little bit bottom-up. So they kind of have this idea that everything, we have the regulations, the legislation. Now it's up for the cities and the practitioners to implement our vision. And we have to tell them, okay, it's not that easy sometimes. There's issues, there's complications, so you were not aware. So we try to do that. We have a political group. We also have the leadership summit. And it kind of works because if you are a local elected, a mayor, and you try to reach the institutions, especially if you're not from a big city, they kind of ignore you. They don't have these channels of communication. But if you bring the mayor of Paris, London, the leadership of Brussels, of Amsterdam together for a single voice, then the Commission starts listening, then the Parliament starts listening. So that's also what we try to do. And finally, we take part on research and innovation to make sure that all of the innovations, all of the new services, all of the new products and capacity building also reach out our members, either by being part of European funded projects or by bringing our members to the projects that are ongoing. We are divided in 5 pillars: the access pillar, environmental and health, governance, safety and security, and traffic efficiency. And I am leading the air quality and clean vehicles cluster, which is part of the environmental and health. So we deal with everything that is electromobility, but also air quality regulations, vehicle emissions, so Euro 7, and how to make sure that this transition for e-mobility is actually a catalyst of change in the way that we move and in the way that our cities work. So I'm going to give a brief policy update. Don't get scared. So I'm not going to be too technical on this, but I just wanted to highlight some of the key legislative packages that are now officially published and will affect electromobility in the future. The most important for now is the CO2 standards for cars and vans, because what this means is that there's a 100% CO2 emission reduction target for the new cars that are sold after 2035. This means basically there's a ban of sales of internal combustion engine cars and vans from 2035 onwards, except for a small part of the fleet which will run on carbon neutral e-fuels. The extent of this fleet, we don't know yet. There's a strong push from some German automakers for this, but I'm sure the majority of the people will not opt for the e-fuels given their current price. Basically what this means is that ICE cars, so gasoline and diesel cars, will still be able to circulate beyond 2035. And if we look at the average age of a car, 12 to 15 years, so probably 2040, 2050, we are still going to witness internal combustion engine cars in our cities. But this also means that there's a clear signal now to the industry that the future is electric. And this also applies for the heavy duty vehicles. So there's now set standards for the CO2 reductions starting in 2030, 45% reduction, and then 65% in 2035 and 90% in 2040. Means the majority of the trucks and coaches will have to be zero emissions, and this either electric or hydrogen. Given the maturity of the technology, is probably electric. But there is a zero emission vehicle mandate for urban buses. So all urban buses purchased from 2035 onwards will have to be zero emissions, and this means mostly electric vehicles. And this poses, of course, a challenge for the cities and the regions that are responsible for purchasing these vehicles and to procure the public transport services, because there's still need for enabling conditions, either funding or the availability of the vehicles. We've seen now that there's a lot of regions and the cities that they are trying to procure their public transport services, and they are trying to look for different brands of vehicles. And at the moment, mostly it's Chinese manufacturers that are able to provide the vehicles with the quantity and the price. And we've seen that also recently with the Lin in Flanders. There was a big controversy because they are buying BYD buses, and the Dutch and Flemish manufacturers were complaining that, okay, this is unfair treatment. So this starts also another issue, which is how do we ensure that this transition is actually in the interest of the European industry. And there's also questions from our members. So what happens to legacy investments? For example, the Clean Vehicles Directive mentions that a clean vehicle at the moment can be biomethane, could be biogas. So we have regions and cities like Madrid or Ile-de-France that made a lot of investments in natural gas and biomethane buses. So what they are asking, so what do we do with this? They can continue to circulate, of course, but for sure the future will have to be electric. And if we are talking about purely urban buses, clearly the Commission has set these targets. So for them, it's really important. Otherwise, we'll not be able to comply with the Green Deal and the ambition to become carbon neutral by 2050. But with all of this electrification of the vehicles, basically, this means that we will have to also deploy charging infrastructure. So to try to solve the chicken and egg issue. And this is what AFIR tries to respond. So basically, it's the new regulation from the Commission substituting AFID, and it establishes mandatory targets. And these can be two-way. One fleet-based target, basically power installed per registered electric vehicle, and then a distance-based target along the main corridors, so at the 10T. And also clearly defines what is publicly accessible, so on-street charging, but also publicly accessible parking lots, private retail, restaurant parking, so shopping malls, could be hospitals, could be restaurants. Basically, irrespective of if the parking is reserved for clients or if parking fees apply, if it's publicly accessible, it's publicly accessible. So it's not just about on street, it could be about also underground parking as long as it's open to the public. To explain a little bit what are these targets, so the easy one is the national fleet-based target. Basically what they say is that countries need to have at least 1.3 kilowatt installed by each battery electric vehicle and 0.8 kilowatt installed by each plug-in electric vehicle. And this has to be met every year at the end of the year. There's a sunset clause. So basically these targets will become smaller and smaller as the number of the vehicles grow. So there's a kind of a limit. As soon as the battery electric fleet reaches 15% of share, this target will no longer apply, because they say, okay, this is needed to kickstart the development of the charging infrastructure. With this amount of vehicles, there's already a critical mass of vehicles that will enable the deployment of the charging infrastructure without needing this stick, let's say. The distance-based target is a bit more complicated. So it's basically along the major corridors, so throughout Europe. And for light duty vehicles, so cars and vans, the objective is to have in every 60 kilometers in each direction, starting from 2025, a minimum pool with the minimum power output starts with 400 kilowatts and then goes to 600 kilowatts with a minimum charger with at least 150 kilowatts. So basically it's like a highway petrol station, but for electric vehicle charging. This is at the core network, and then at the comprehensive network, a little bit less ambitious. So it doesn't start with 100% of the network, but it will grow. And the objective in the end is by 2035 to have the same every 60 kilometers in each direction, a pool of at least 600 kilowatts of charging capacity with minimum 2 chargers with 150 kilowatts, so ultra-fast chargers. This is, for example, to support long distance travel, to reduce the range anxiety of the drivers, because it's a big concern now. I have my electric vehicle, it only has 200 kilometers range. So how do I go from, I don't know, from Brussels to Amsterdam or to Paris? I don't want to run out of battery in the middle of the road. So I need to be sure that I can charge my vehicles. Even more so for heavy duty vehicles, because a lot of the transport is transboundary. So it's not just located within the borders of a country. So there's also objectives of distance-based targets, starting with 15% of the network next year until 100% of the network by 2030. The distance is a little bit different. So it starts with 120 kilometers, but of course the power output is much bigger. So we are talking about starting 1,400 kilowatts with a minimum charger of 350 kilowatts along the 10T corridor that will evolve to 2,800 kilowatts with a minimum 2 350 kilowatt chargers. So this means that truck drivers will be able to charge very quickly their trucks to continue their travel, for example, during their breaks, because they are mandatory. So the idea is to create this safe and secure resting areas where truck drivers can take a quick rest, at the same time charge their trucks and continue their trips. Why is this important for cities? Although AFIR is applied to member states, and they will have to implement this national policy frameworks and also mention the measures that they will implement to support the rollout of charging infrastructure. Basically, what is seen in other processes, for example, air quality plans or others, is that member states will go to cities and the regions and we're going to ask you, so this will end up in your desk, what are you doing? How many chargers have you installed? Which enabling measures are you implementing? And then they will report this to the Commission. So I put these 3 articles because I think they will, one way or another, they will end up at cities' desks, at the regions' desks. So I just wanted you to be aware of this. Of course, the presentation will be shared afterwards, so don't need to go very deeply through this, but just mentioning some of the important aspects of this regulation. And now that I spent a little bit of time talking about legislation, I'm going to now focus a little bit on what are the challenges and opportunities of e-mobility. First of all, I wanted to say, from the POLIS perspective, we don't see electric vehicles as the silver bullet. We've seen now that the Commission is pushing a lot for electrification. The auto industry is pushing a lot for electrification because in the end, they just want to sell cars. So they are very much pushing for a one-to-one replacement between gasoline and diesel cars for electric vehicles. And from our point of view, this is not ideal. We need to use electromobility as a catalyst for a fundamental change in the way that people and goods move around the cities. So we need less cars. Of course, we need some cars will still have space in cities, but they have to have a more adequate space. They cannot continue to have the priority in policies because we need to give back space for people, for our children, for active modes, for public transport. But there's still a place for cars in cities and they should be as cleaner as possible. So we are not against electrification. We are very much for electrification, but also we need to ensure that the correct priorities are set in place. So the priorities should also always be active modes and people, and then public transport, shared mobility, and then electromobility and electro-individual mobility, let's say, because also public transport and active modes are also part of the e-mobility ecosystem. I also wanted to highlight that electromobility is not just about cars. Again, it comes in many shapes and sizes. It's about logistics. It's about public transport. It's about shared mobility. We have in our cities at the moment a completely diverse set of vehicles circulating in our roads, in our streets, and the cities need to be ready to respond to this challenge. They are also electrifying. And there's also vehicles that we are not even considering today. For example, the autonomous vehicles, the small deliverables vehicles, and whatever comes in the future. So we kind of need to anticipate that there's going to be a change. Now, for example, people are discussing drones and urban air mobility. So it's a big challenge. It's not easy. I used to work in a city, so it's not easy to navigate given the amount of time and the amount of work that we have. It's really hard sometimes to respond to these challenges, but it's something that will need to be addressed in a proactive way. Another issue that we are looking and that electrification is not solving is the autobesity. What we're seeing now is the vehicles are becoming bigger and bigger. Not just about SUVs, but even the smaller vehicles, the models are getting bigger. There was a recent study from Transport and Environment, and I think it was like 1 centimeter every 2 years, where the growth of the vehicles. And this creates a problem because electromobility and charging is not just about charging, it's also about public space. It's about parking. So even if this big vehicle is electric, it's still going to continue to block the tram. So a lot of the cities are simply not ready because there's no space for the growth of the vehicles. We've been having discussions, for example, with the Brussels region, and they are very much concerned about the proliferation of these large trucks that have no place in urban environments. I remember being in Bruges quite recently, spending some holidays with my family, and I had even took a picture of my mother, which is like 1.60 m or next to one of these cars, and the driver cannot absolutely see her if she's in front of the vehicle. So let alone children, for example. These are dangerous. These are not fit for the cities. So how can cities deal with electromobility? I also bring this image from my own city. So I'm originally from Lisbon. And just to highlight that electromobility is not something new. It's been here for ages. So this is one of the classic trams that I used to take. but also shows how badly designed parking and mobility policy can create chaos. So we see next to the tram a lot of illegally parked cars. And this is something that the cities, all, not just of course Lisbon, but a lot of the cities need to deal, which is a huge amount of cars, how to ensure that the right vehicles are entering the city, the vehicles that actually make the city work. We're talking about, for example, deliveries, vehicles, public transport, taxis, ride hailing, and try to minimize the impact of all of the vehicles that are coming from outside of the cities that every day need to circulate there, either because they have no alternatives or because they choose to bring the car. So how can cities do this? First of all, for example, using a mix of carrots and sticks. So in terms of the policy, they can implement low emission zones or zero emission zones to accelerate the transition for cleaner vehicles. But for this, of course, they also need to support the expansion of the charging infrastructure. And they can also start by giving the example. And we see that a lot of the cities are already leading the way when it comes to electrification, because they start with their own fleets and they support the electrification of captive fleets, for example, providing charging plazas for taxis or for ride hailing services. It's also important that there's on the governance part of things that there's an oversight on local mobility as a service ecosystems. A good example is the shared e-scooters that they proliferated after the COVID pandemic, and now it's creating a lot of problems for some cities. So they are trying to respond. Paris, for example, banned the shared scooters. Brussels is trying to restrict the number of these vehicles and also creating specific parking places, because indeed, when we talk about electromobility and charging, we also need to talk about parking. And then management of the public space. Public space is scarce. Well, cities are already cluttered with a lot of urban furniture, so we need to be careful on how to deploy charging infrastructure in a way that it doesn't create another layer of obstacles, for example, for people with reduced mobility. And these are some of the questions that our membership has been discussing in the past years about this. So, for example, the first question that we have from our members: should these networks of charging infrastructure should be public, private? Should we leave it fully to the market? Should we be owners of the charging infrastructure? Well, there's no one size fits all. We see, for example, in Spain, the city of Barcelona, they want to be owners of the charging infrastructure. The city of Madrid, they say we do not have the capacity, so we give it to the private sector. What both of them do in common is that they decide where the charging infrastructure is. They promote the location, so they control, they manage the public space. Then there's the integration with the parking policy, because indeed these vehicles, at least in the public space, they will charge in parking places. So, for example, for cities that don't have a parking policy or a tariffication of their parking policy, they need to start thinking about this. Otherwise, they will just be providing free space for a business model. And talking about the business model, there's also some questions, including, for example, from the city of Leuven. How do we share? So we are providing free public space, because usually what happens is that the electric vehicle, when it's charging, they are not paying for the parking. There's free parking in a lot of cities. So the charge point operator is making some profit, ideally making some profit using free public space. So how do cities also get part of this revenue, for example? And this can be done through the procurement or the public tenders, but they're still under discussion. And then the integration, I mentioned this, with existing urban landscape. And then two more emerging concerns. This is mostly from the cities that are already deploying very large charging infrastructure. For example, in the Netherlands, there's already grid problems. So the grid congestion, they are trying to increase the number of electric vehicles and the number of chargers, but sometimes there's no electric capacity, no available capacity. So how do we deal with this? And they are now looking, for example, as innovations such as smart charging or vehicle to grid. So it's in a way that instead of just collecting energy from the grid, the vehicle can provide and can act as a battery on wheels. To provide a little bit of balance. With smart charging, the idea is to delay the charging session for when, for example, there's more production from renewable energy or when it's cheaper. It's interesting to say that in the Netherlands, for example, the default is already smart charging. They don't explain to the people that because it also brings complications. Usually the user, he doesn't care if it's smart or not. He just wants to have his car charged when he comes back. So this is what they say. Okay, we don't explain this very complex thing. We just say smart charging and we adjust. We just ensure that the vehicle is charged, but we can modulate the consumptions of the fleet to ensure that there's no peaks in it's more or less like we do at home. So if you turn on the oven, the vacuum cleaner, and the TV and everything at the same time, of course, the lights go out. And in some regions and the cities, this is starting to happen. There's also a big capacity building need when it comes to the permitting and the grid connection processes. We've seen that. So we have a lot of cities now dealing with charge point operators asking for authorizations for installing charging points. And this takes ages because it's something new. The administrations are not ready, so it's not really an agile process at the moment. So there's a need to accelerate and streamline these processes, because it also creates less anxiety and less burdens for both the city and the operator. And of course, this helps also with the business model. And finally, two other important topics. One of them is promoting electromobility in urban logistics. For example, having small urban consolidation centers within the city, so the trucks cannot access the city. Last mile delivery can be done via small electric vehicles that can navigate better in the urban infrastructure. And finally, regulations and governance. So it's important now that there's this charging infrastructure, there's charging sessions, there's a lot of information going. So what chargers are being used, the ones that are not being used. So it's important that the cities and the local authorities have access to this data in order to also to better prepare for future expansions. The cities need to know where there's lacking infrastructure, where there's infrastructure that's not being used, and understand why. I brought some examples of when the charging infrastructure is not correctly put in place, humans can be quite creative. So these are some examples I took from Lisbon, from my city. So if there's no charging, people will just try to plug their cars to whatever available plug there is, which creates a very dangerous situation for people on wheelchairs, for people with disabilities, for blind people, or even for distracted people. So this is not ideal. But there's also creativity from the sides of the city. So there's a few examples, for example, using wireless charging in Gothenburg, but also using already existing charging infrastructure, like bollards and lampposts to promote long-term charging, so slow charging in residential areas. This reduces the need to install additional infrastructure. This creates less barriers for the users. And so these are three good examples of how cities can also be creative responding to a challenge. What's important to understand is that when we are deploying charging infrastructure, we need to make things right for everyone. So I have in my left a picture, this was taken in Brussels. So I believe that originally the charger was in the sidewalk. They moved it to the road to remove the barrier, so the sidewalk remains open for everyone. And of course, this reduces a little bit of the parking place, but ensures that there's no obstacles in the sidewalk. And on my right, I don't know exactly where this is from, maybe not even from Europe, but this is an example on how not to do it. So the vehicle is charging, and in the middle, there's the cycle path. So this basically creates an obstacle, let's say even a trap. We can call it a trap for cyclists that are distracted. So there's the correct way of doing and the incorrect way of doing. And sometimes it's not easy when there's already so much urban furniture to try to make things right. And also, it's important to mention that electrification is just part of a strategy. So now even with the 10T regulation, so every urban node will have to have a sustainable urban mobility plan, but also for smaller cities. It's important to ensure that electrification is aligned with the mobility and the parking strategies of the cities. So for example, if a city doesn't want cars in the center, regardless of if they are electric or combustion engine, they shouldn't put chargers in the city center. You should probably prioritize underground parking or park and ride. We've seen that, for example, in Stockholm, they were having this internal discussion because also sometimes what happens is that the different departments of the cities do not communicate. So the environmental department, the mobility department, and I've been there. I work for a city and I know how these things work. So we have the environmental department and the electrification department that they wanted to put chargers in every municipal parking place, which are located in the city center. And then you have the mobility department saying we don't want cars in the city center. So there was this conflicting between two different departments and the conflicting strategies. So it's important to have a clear vision, proper planning, and alignment between all of these needs. At POLIS, and I just wanted to mention some of the support that we and the Commission is trying to provide for the public authorities. We are part of what's called the Sustainable Transport Forum, which is basically an expert group of different actors. It includes, of course, cities and regions. And the idea is to support the Commission on implementation of AFIR and bring them some questions and some challenges that they didn't think at first, but they needed to be addressed. So basically, there's several subgroups, and there's one specifically on public authorities that deal, for example, with different issues. One of them was the permitting and the grid connections. Then there's common templates and standards procedures. There's a task force for captive fleets and specialized fleets. There's a specific task force on the update of the SUMP guide for the electrification aspects. There's also recommendations on accessibility and inclusivity. And finally, one for fire safety. And now there's a new one on the update of the recommendations for the procuring and tenders of electric recharging infrastructure. So this might be of interest for you. So there's already a handbook which is being updated. And it's quite a challenge because these subgroups, of course, we put charge point operators, OEMs, cities, regions, public authorities, and they have different interests. So when it comes to the handbook, for example, it's being updated by charge point operators, and it's mostly at the moment kind of a list of requests. So what do we need from cities? And POLIS and some of our members are saying, okay, this is also important to put the vision of the cities. In the end, they are the ones that need to manage the public space. So for example, in the original version, there was no mention of public space. So we are trying to make sure that this part of the interests of the public authorities are also part of the document. There's already some documents produced, so you can check on the website of the Commission. So, for example, the electrification and the SUMP, it's being updated. There's already some of the documents available online that you can check. It not only with the highlight of the problem, but with good examples from cities and regions. So it might be of interest to you. And when it comes to logistics, there's also documents produced by POLIS and in partnership with other organizations. I can share the links for these documents in the presentation. I can include them for you also to check online. So there's a lot of information. We just need to ensure, and this is our challenge, that it reaches the city practitioners, because in the end, it's going to be you that will have to deal with the problem, and we'll have to navigate all of these challenges. Going through the support also from the Commission, there's the European Alternative Fuels Observatory, which is basically a reference portal for everything that is alternative fuels and infrastructure. So it's now available online. It has a huge amount of data and information. I do recommend you to check it out because there's a lot of guidelines, also interesting documents. There's maps and charts about the status of electric vehicle deployment in each member state and at the EU, but also the charging and refueling infrastructure. I have this graph here in the right, which is quite interesting, that shows how the AFIR fleet-based target is being implemented or not. So you see the blue dot, which is the target, and then the orange areas, which is the actual output. So for example, Belgium at the moment has more than enough installed capacity, the same like France, Germany, or the Netherlands. This also shows that the majority of the charging infrastructure is concentrated in 3 countries, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. So there's kind of a 2-speed Europe when it comes to electrification, and this is a challenge. But also shows that when there's too much power installed compared to the actual fleet, this creates a problem of efficient use of the charging infrastructure, because we need to consider that it's now becoming a business model. So if we have a lot of chargers that are not being used, this is basically a waste of capacity at the moment, but also a waste of public space. So this also means that the cities, the regions, and the national states need to look into what are the actual needs and make sure that when they install the capacity, it's meeting those needs. In terms of the regional policies, there's 2 in the moment. I think also from Brussels region. So Flanders has a plan for support of so there's a framework for electrification and charging infrastructure, and the objective is quite ambitious. It's almost 30,000 charging points, and as far as I could understand, it's about defining 5 different lots, and then we have the tender. similar to Wallonie. So there's the objectives of numbers of charge points to be installed in the Wallonia region. So of course this will have to be done in conjunction with the cities, and probably some of these things will have to be updated now that AFIR is in place. So for example, the Wallonian one was still referring to AFID, so to the previous regulation. So probably this will have to be updated to see if it's aligned with AFIR targets. So there's a lot of guidelines, recommendations, policy support, but I agree that it's not easy to navigate all of this. So I will try to go now to the final part of my presentation, bringing some examples from cities, from our membership. For example, when it comes to managing public space, Barcelona has an interesting strategy. They have on-street fast charging. So what they say is that if you are visiting the city, if you need a quick top-up, you can use the on-street charging. But the slow charging, the smart charging, it's all in underground parking. They say we don't want cars in the city. If you have to charge, you charge it underground. If you have to charge fast, you can charge on the street, but then you can continue your trip because space is scarce and we don't want too many cars in the public space. It's a bit like the strategy of the city of Leuven also. They prioritize if you have to charge, you charge in parking or at home. And if you want to charge on the public space, you just charge fast. So the idea is not to have the cars spending too much time on the curbside. Also, they say they have a preference for this gradual rollout strategy, which is basically charge privately or semi-publicly as much as possible, and go start small and then increase gradually the number of the chargers depending on the needs. They are two interesting strategies and two good examples on how to support EV charging without occupying too much public space, at least at the surface. Then there's also interesting examples from cities when it comes to instead of looking at demand base, so people ask for a charger and the city provides a charger, they do modeling to see in a data-driven approach where the future chargers should be. So Rotterdam, for example, they look at the future prognostic in terms of the number of vehicles, the charging needs, and they define with the grid according to the occupation of the current chargers, the urban developments, the future needs, where the new chargers should be located. So they ensure that there's an efficient use of the chargers. They are going to be installed when they are needed, and they minimize the risk of having chargers occupying space that are not used. So this approach is also used in different cities. So for example, Turku, they recently presented this at the POLIS conference as part of a project, a European project that they have. They defined an attraction model, determines how many and which kind of charging points could be installed in these smaller areas. And this could be AC slow chargers, but also DC fast chargers. Basically, they connect all of this information, they put it on a model, and they say, okay, this is where we need, this is where we need less, and let's make this in a way that's efficient in the use of public space. And the same for Utrecht. They have a quite ambitious charging infrastructure plan. So all of these points are charging stations, and some of them are for the public, others are for trucks, and then for taxis. So there's these different types of chargers, but they also use a data-driven rollout where they see where the needs are going to be in the future. Then if we look at other fleets, for example, the city of Madrid has an ambitious target for the zero emission buses. So they are one of the first or the first major city to have no diesel buses in their fleet. So they either have electric or natural gas. And they are doing an alignment between their electrification strategy, but also the sustainable mobility strategy. So they have 3 low emission zones, but also an environmental sustainable strategy to meet the Ambient Air Quality Directive objectives and to have zero emission transport within the city. So this is what they have now at the moment. So more than 2,000 buses, and 1/3 is fully electric. The rest is natural gas. And their plan is to increase the number of electric vehicles and simultaneously decrease the number of natural gas vehicles. And they have a really interesting strategy where they use a mix of national funding, European funding, and EU projects implement not just the purchase of the vehicles, but also, for example, the capacity building when it comes to operational needs, to charging needs. So it's quite an interesting example of how to leverage funding to accelerate electromobility. And now recently, part of the National Climate Agreement in the Netherlands, there's the objective of establish zero emission zones for freight in the biggest Dutch cities. Amsterdam is one example. So they now are establishing a zero emission zone for taxis, vans, and trucks from 25 onwards. And they say that instead of targeting the private, so the individuals, they are saying, okay, you are targeting businesses, they are making money, so it's easier for them to accelerate this shift instead of targeting first the citizens. So it's an interesting approach. It's a little bit different than other low emissions and zero emission zones. Let's see how this works. I was recently in Amsterdam where they presented this. I like the idea. Also, it's gradual, so it doesn't. They give some time for the fleets to adapt. But I think it's indeed an interesting approach, because if you look at these kinds of vehicles, they are the ones that make a lot of kilometers in the city. So they are the captive fleets. So I would say 150 kilometers per day, sometimes more. So they also have a big impact when it comes to emissions, noise, etc. Looking also at logistics, there's ways of maybe providing buy-in from the private sector. So Flanders has a Green Deal for logistics. So Brussels region recently also published their Green Deal. So the idea is to bring public and private organizations together, so they commit to accelerate decarbonization of logistics. And this is quite important because logistics is basically what makes city live. So they are responsible for bringing our food to the supermarkets, our products, our daily to bring our purchases. So without decarbonizing logistics, it's going to be really hard to meet air quality and CO2 targets and climate action targets. And finally, I'm just going to finalize a little bit with some of the research and innovation projects and how can this also support the cities. So for example, our members are part of different projects. Some of them are related to vehicle access regulations, also to logistics and electromobility. We've been recently in Barcelona as part of the eCharge for Drivers project, where we could see battery swapping solutions for electric motorbikes. So it's an idea that they say, okay, instead of buying the motorbike with the battery included, you have battery as a service. It reduces the initial purchase cost of the vehicle, and we just ensure that whenever you need to continue a trip, you just go there, you swap one empty battery with the new one. And we see the same in Berlin, mostly for light electric vehicles, so e-scooters, but also bikes. And this is mostly for example, for the gig workers. They need to deliver their goods or to deliver their Uber Eats, and they don't have time to charge. So they just go to one place like this and they swap their empty battery for a new one, then they can continue. This also creates a little bit of safety, because then they don't need to charge these vehicles at home, these batteries at home. And what we've seen recently is that a lot of gig workers, what they do is that they adapt their two-wheelers with parts coming from AliExpress, and they are not compliant with safety regulations. So we've seen a lot of fire safety issues with these vehicles. So this is one way to also promote electric mobility and minimizing these risks. Some other examples from Belgium and Amsterdam is how to make sure that electrification is about also changing the way that people move. So creating e-hubs where you have different types of vehicles, two-wheelers, but also shared vehicles that can park and charge. So it also creates a little bit of order in the chaos, which is vehicle parking and circulation. And two other examples, one of them is the city of Utrecht, which is basically now developing a bidirectional ecosystem. They have around 500 vehicle-to-grid capable cars, shared cars by We Drive Solar, and charging points around 3,000. So they are testing this system and trying to reduce the grid burden and to ensure that the vehicles are not just transporting people, but they are just also an asset to the city. So this is being tested as part of the Scale project. It's quite interesting. Let's see how it ends and if it can be replicated in other contexts. Also, when you're going back to Madrid, they also have this interesting approach for logistics. So the Urban Consolidation Center, located right in the center in Plaza Mayor, And basically the idea is if you have to do like not last mile, it's like 3 kilometers. This can be done with smaller electric vehicles. So every big vehicle needs to bring their own cargo there to this consolidation center, and from there is distributed to the remaining parts of the city with vehicles that are mostly fit for the urban environment instead of the big trucks. So to finalize some of the things to consider, because I've been talking for quite some time, learnings from our experience with our members and our exchanges. There's no one size fits all approach. So some cities prefer to have fully public, some cities prefer to leave it to the private sector. The level of overview and control may vary, but setting ambitious targets, ensuring enforcement and communication strategies are key, regardless of the option that you have. The most successful cases also start with their own fleets, giving the example. So municipal vehicles, public transport, waste collection vehicles, and they provide enabling conditions for the captive fleets, also to support ride-hailing, logistics, and taxis. 2 or 3 other learnings: the importance of the EV charging and parking strategies to be aligned, because we'll charge vehicles in parking places, and these charging vehicles or the charging infrastructure needs a viable business model. And we should look also at the functional urban area, so the metropolitan area, in order to align governance, to coordinate policies. I know in Belgium it's not easy. We've seen this also with, for example, low emission zones. Flanders has one policy, Brussels has another, Wallonia has another. So sometimes it's not easy. But it's important to at least have some kind of coordination when it comes to so I like the example of the Flemish framework for electric vehicle charging, because it ensures that there's a bit of coordination, so cities are not just left alone doing their own thing. And finally, this is not just about cars. This is about several different vehicles. So don't just focus on cars. There's a lot of different vehicles that are now electrifying, and also these will require a response. Probably not about public charging on street, but for example, depots for trucks and buses. And don't be afraid to use both the carrots, which are parking policies that incentivize electric vehicles, incentives for the purchase of the vehicles, but also use the sticks. So it's impossible to have one thing without the other. And public-private cooperation, we've learned this via our European projects, our discussion with stakeholders. It's really important. Having examples like the Green Deal for logistics is quite a useful approach, but also capacity building. And finally, something that we have been pushing a lot is we need funding, adequate funding for the cities and the regions, for example, that responds to their needs. I know that at the European level, there's a big fight, of course, for the budget, for the research and innovation, but we feel that we need more Fit for Cities funding. And I think I'm done. I'm just going to invite you, if you are interested in coming to our POLIS conference in Karlsruhe at the end of the year. So some of these innovations will be presented there for sure. It's a perfect place to exchange with other city practitioners. We are going to have an amazing lineup of speakers. So for example, Rosanne, that's going to speak after me, was a speaker last year at the POLIS conference. And I hope to see you there. And thank you so much for this. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Pedro, both for that invitation to Karlsruhe as well as for the extensive overview. Lots of ground you've covered there. I'm just going to check if somebody put a question in the chat or raised his or her hand during the presentation. I believe not. Is there a question for Pedro at this point about some things he told us? If not, you can always come back to me with the question after all the presentations are finished. No questions at this point. Okay, then I propose we just carry on with the next presentation. If that's okay for you, Rosanne, you can share your screen.
Yeah, sure. All right. I just realized, Pedro, that indeed last year I think I presented a similar topic, the study on during the POLIS conference, the impact. Do you still see
yes,
the presentation, or do you see it in the presentation mode?
It's clearly visible. Yeah.
Okay. Because sometimes Teams does it wrong. All right, so maybe before I start, I will quickly present myself. So I'm a researcher working at Transport and Mobility Leuven, and let's call it briefly TML. TML is a study agency in Leuven, and we're doing all kind of research on transport and mobility issues. So not only on cars or not only on electrification, but I did a lot of work already on electrification and the implications it has for society. On the one hand, with respect to affordability and accessibility, but also other aspects about the evolution of the car fleet and so on. But today I will focus on the issue of affordability and accessibility, which is actually multidimensional. So when we look at the introduction of a new technology, as electric vehicles are, there are usually issues with respect to equity and fairness to people from lower income categories. And for electric vehicles, we see actually there are multiple dimensions to this. I will not have the time to go into detail to all of them, but I will spend most of the time on the issues which are most relevant to you as local policymakers, where you can have an influence. This means that part of my talk will overlap a little bit with what Pedro just told, but the focus is a bit different. It's really focused on how can we make it accessible to everybody, that we leave nobody behind, and that it creates a feeling of fairness in society. But when I quickly run over the different aspects, so you have the purchase costs, that is, I think, very well known of electric vehicles, that is today still too high, and we do not yet have a good second-hand market with affordable vehicles. The second item is the one which I will spend most of the time on. That's on the accessibility of charging infrastructure. The chicken and the egg problem. People that can charge at home, that can install a charger, they are typically able to buy electric vehicles, but if you cannot install charging infrastructure, then it's much harder, or the barrier is much higher to switch to an electric vehicle. Then there's also a big difference in pricing if you have to charge at home or on a public charger. One reason is the VAT issue, but in general, public charging is more expensive than private charging, especially if you have solar panels on your roof. You can charge very cheap, and you can have a car with very low use costs, but this is not the case for people who are reliant on public charging. Another issue is the one that I won't touch upon much of, accessibility and usability of the charging technology. There is a lot of heterogeneity in the number of charging points and diversity of charging points, and the subscriptions that you need. You need a smartphone app. So for not all people, this is easy to use or straightforward to use. So there's still a way to go in streamlining this process and make it more usable to all citizens. And then lastly, we expect with increasing carbon prices that fuel prices on diesel and gasoline will stay high and will become even higher. So this means that for people who cannot afford an EV, they are worse off because they will pay high taxes, high price, and we have to come with a solution for those people. So the equity issues for electrification, the fairness issues can basically be structured into 3 main themes. You have the issue of availability, the issue of affordability, and the issue of accessibility. They are related, but they're different. And I think as a local policymaker, you can mainly work on this aspect, the aspect of accessibility, but I will briefly touch also upon availability and affordability issues that you just have the full story. So with respect to availability, today most car manufacturers want to sell the most profitable models, and those are the large SUVs and the premium models, and therefore we see on the market nowadays that the available cars, except for the Chinese models, are the ones that are large, that are luxury cars, and that are very expensive. A study by Transport and Environment shows that only 70% of the electric cars in Europe are in the B segment, so the smaller segment that's like the Peugeot 206 and so on. While for the combustion engine vehicles, the combustion engine cars, 37% are in this smaller segment. So there is a demand, a large demand. More than 1/3 of the people ask these smaller cars, but there are simply not sufficient small electric vehicles available on the market. So that's an availability issue that keeps the price high, and that is responsibility of the manufacturers to come with more affordable models. When we look at the total cost of ownership, so the TCO, the total cost of a car over its lifetime, when you include all cost items, nearly all studies show that an electric vehicle is either as affordable or even cheaper than an internal combustion engine vehicle. And this is because of the use costs. But when you look at the composition of this total cost of ownership, we see that for electric vehicles, the purchase cost is the main driver. So the purchase cost remains a barrier, and that is something you have to pay upfront. There are little number of cars, electric vehicles below 40K. So this is not a budget that a medium or a low income household has to pay for a car. Typically, governments respond to this with purchase subsidies, but if you ask economists, purchase subsidies are probably the worst incentive from an economic viewpoint. It's not an efficient way to spend government money, because they benefit mainly people who do not need support. The purchase price of an electric vehicle remains high, too high for low income or medium income households, and therefore it misses its goal mainly. When we look at purchase subsidies for second-hand cars, typically those purchase subsidies are lower, and actually you have the same problem. We do not have a second-hand market at this time, and the prices in this market are still very high. So the purchase cost for the vehicle remains a barrier. Then what is most relevant and most important for you as local policymakers are the accessibility issues, and with accessibility, there we mainly see issues with respect to charging infrastructure. Low-income households typically live in houses that do not have a separate parking area, so that do not have the place or the infrastructure to install a charging point at home, and therefore these people are more than the more affluent households reliant on public charging infrastructure. However, we see that the charging costs for public charging is much higher than when you can charge at home. So here I made a comparison based on electricity prices in Belgium and prices for public charging, average prices, because there's a lot of variation in prices in public charging. But if you look at average price, you see that the cost of charging is more than double when you have to charge publicly, which means in practice that the use cost of your car will also double. And if we make a quick calculation, we see that if you have to charge publicly all the time, so if you cannot charge at home, this will mean that your electric car in terms of use cost will cost you even more than a regular gasoline vehicle. So there we create actually a big difference between people who can charge at home, which are usually already the people who are in the higher income categories. Even and if they then have solar panels, they can charge at even lower prices than this 34 cents per kilowatt hour that is mentioned here. This is actually the average price of a household electricity in Belgium. But if you have, obviously, if you can charge with solar panels, then you even pay lower cost. So you create actually a wedge between people who can charge at home, that can charge at really low costs, and people who are reliant on public charging infrastructure. And research has shown that it are the people from low income categories that are more reliant on public charging infrastructure. So this is a significant inequality issue that arises. Apart from that, so this is obviously an issue, but this assumes that the charging infrastructure is there. But what we also see is that the deployment of the charging infrastructure, which is, of course, in terms of a business case, makes sense. This charging infrastructure is mainly deployed in more affluent areas, so where rich people live and where currently the demand is. But then Pedro mentioned it earlier as well. We have the chicken and the egg problem. If there are no chargers available and you cannot charge at home, then as a household you cannot buy an electric car because you don't see opportunities to charge your vehicle. So as long as there's no charging infrastructure developed, people living there will not switch to electric vehicles. So governments can use the deployment of public chargers to stimulate the uptake of electric vehicles, but it is a different it is a difficult equilibrium exercise, because obviously also Pedro mentioned this as well, you don't want to have a lot of chargers installed that are never used. So it requires a very careful demand analysis on where potential demand for electric vehicle exists, and so it requires quite some upfront planning and analysis on where is the potential for EV deployment. Also, with respect to accessibility, issues, there are quite some spatial implication of the deployment of EV charging infrastructure. When we look at how cities typically tackle this, you basically have two main approaches, either the demand-driven approach, so where cities actually wait for EV owners to ask for the installation of the charging point. And on the other hand, you have the planning-oriented approach, and there the local authority will take the lead and first make a study of where are the needs, what are the opportunities, where do we have space, and then charging points will be placed based on this approach. I will not advocate for one approach versus another because they both have advantages and disadvantages. With the demand-driven approach, the advantage, of course, is that you know that when you place or that when you install a charger, that it will be used because it's demand-driven. So it's easy to convince operators of these charging points to install such a point because it's demand driven. The downside of this is that it typically takes long, the process to get your point installed, because it requires a lot of going back and forth between stakeholders for what is the optimal location, and you have to talk to the grid operator and to the local authority, to the different users. So it's a process that takes long. It's a long administrative process. And also you will typically have areas where there are no charging points. So there are areas where you cannot stimulate the EV uptake. With a planning-oriented approach, there you need more time upfront, so it requires more time and resources upfront. But once you have your map of all the required charging points, then you can go much faster. So it is a bit of a weighing of pros and cons, and nowadays we actually see that a lot of cities use a mix of demand-driven and plant-oriented approach, that in a very initial stage the process is demand-driven, but then eventually the city takes over and it becomes more planning oriented. In any case, the planning of the deployment of charging infrastructure should be integrated with three other policy plans: the parking policy, the mobility policy, and the urban planning policy. This is also something where Pedro gave a lot of good examples. So with respect to parking policy, you really need to think on how are we going to deal with vehicles that use parking spots for a very long time, because EV charging is slower than conventional refueling. So you'll have a lot of cars that actually are at a place for a long time. So you should have smart meters that for example, have a differentiated tariff, where as soon as the car is fully charged, the tariff starts to increase significantly, so that the user has an incentive to move its car as soon as the battery is fully charged, and does not block, if you want, the charger. Then there is the discussion: do we need fast chargers? Do we need regular chargers? A fast charger, obviously, when you place fast chargers, you need less chargers. So you reduce the number of charging points because there is faster circulation, but these fast chargers are bigger, and they're typically very useful to be placed in separate areas like fuel stations, but they are not ideal to place on the streets. They are too big for on-street charging. With respect to the mobility policy, you have to think very carefully. For example, in car-free zones, there you want to avoid to place charging infrastructure, because as soon as you place charging infrastructure, you will attract vehicles. So car-free zone or low car zones. So this is something that should be taken into account very carefully. EV charging also for public transport, that requires separate stations, because that typically requires a lot of space. With respect to urban planning, very recently there's a new law that has been approved by the European Commission, the Energy Performance Building Directive, or the revised Energy Performance and Building Directive. And there also is an article that stipulates the requirements for buildings, new buildings in the future with respect to charging infrastructure for vehicles. So this mainly applies to apartment buildings, for example. So in the future, apartment buildings will have requirements on the number of charging stations, and they will also have the right to plug. So people will have the right to charge their vehicles. Yeah, this is an example actually of a solution for on-street charging point in Mechelen. Because one of the main issues with this is a private charging station, but one of the main issues with houses that do not have a separate parking area is that when you have a private charging point, you have the wire that crosses the sidewalk, and this is a solution that they had in Mechelen, that you have it over the sidewalk. I'm not fully convinced that it is the most ideal and elegant solution, because I still see some issues might popping up, but it is work in process. It was an test project, and I'm very convinced that we will see in the future all kind of innovative solutions to overcome these kind of issues. So basically, I want to conclude with summarizing that the electrification of the car fleet has different dimensions of issues that might lead to mobility poverty. Therefore, this is something that policymakers should keep in mind, and for local policy makers, you can mainly focus on the issues of accessibility. What also should be thought of is of alternatives for EV purchase, because obviously EV purchase prices will decline, but some problems might not be fully resolved. So therefore, or in the meantime, we should be able to offer sufficient alternatives to people to avoid them to fall into the trap of mobility poverty. These can be stronger public transport services, but also there is a very strong potential for electric car sharing schemes, especially in cities, where we see in other European cities this electric car sharing schemes becoming more and more popular, where you can save space and still have the benefit of using a car without having to pay for the high purchase price. And then there's the issue of charging opportunities and prices that policymakers should keep in mind. So there should be a deployment of a public charging network that should be embedded in mobility planning and mobility policy, parking policy and urban planning policy. But there is this issue of pricing that remains, that public charging will remain more expensive than home charging. And this is something that we have to take into account, that this affects the use costs of cars. Okay, that was mainly what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Rosanne, for that insightful presentation. Really interesting. And also a topic I believe we often see electrification as like a technological challenge, but it's also a social or societal challenge as well, especially in the light of mobility poverty and the differences between different groups within our cities and towns. So thank you very much for that, for drawing our attention to that. I'm again going to ask the audience if there are questions for Rosanne. Pedro has one, I see. Go ahead, Pedro.
Do you mind if also speakers can be part of it in those questions?
Sure, go ahead.
No, it's a comment and a question. So thanks, Rosanne, for your presentation. It's really insightful, the way that you look at the different aspects about accessibility of charging. And we also had this discussion during the POLIS conference session, and you mentioned this, the cost of the vehicle, and it was something that Brussels region presented the total cost of ownership tool that they are having. For EAF, we also have this, but we are seeing more and more, and I wanted to ask your opinion on this, that for the user, the total cost of ownership is kind of irrelevant, because as you mentioned, the initial purchase cost is what drives people to TCO is good for fleet managers if you want to buy a truck or if you want to purchase a bus, but for private people, individuals, especially the people with lower incomes, for them maybe it's not as important. So I would like to ask you first if you feel that indeed it's the purchase cost that drives or not.
Yes, I totally agree. So obviously the use cost become important once you have your vehicle, but in the decision to purchase a vehicle, it's the purchase cost that matters, and use costs are less important because it's the purchase cost that is such a significant part of the total cost of your vehicle, and it has to be paid upfront. It is a budget that not every household just has on their accounts. So it's definitely the significant barrier for EV uptake nowadays, and I think it's a misconception for policymakers, because indeed a lot of studies show like TCO is lower, so the uptake will come, but for regular households, it does not matter that the TCO is lower. They have to be able to pay for the vehicle, and there are solutions for a subset of people who can have like the company cars. They can avoid having to pay the purchase costs, and they can use the electric vehicles. But for people who do not have access to company cars, electric cars now are still quite unaffordable.
Yeah, thanks for this. It's true, and based on your presentation, also our discussions, what I fear is that electromobility that should be the catalyst for change, especially because of the prices of the way that we move. So relying less on private cars and more on transport modes, shared vehicles, we are missing that opportunity. And also because I think the Commission and the institutions, they listen more when it comes to the Brussels bubble. Let's say the automakers are here, the big industry is here, and sometimes the citizens are not that well represented. That's why we see tools like the TCO and other policies that actually are, as you said, subsidizing the rich. I just wanted to maybe include something that as a follow-up to your presentation. Now the Commission is also discussing what they call the Social Climate Fund.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And for the first time, I think there's a definition of transport poverty.
Okay.
So which is very much aligned with what Rosanne says. But basically, I'm going to copy and paste here. So it's basically looking at individuals and households that will not be able to comply with the costs of mobility, either because they don't have transport options public transport options. They are forced to buy a car, or because they don't have any capacity of affording their own mobility. So it's interesting now that this is becoming more and more important. It's being under discussion now, and we are trying at POLIS to make sure that, for example, when it comes to providing support, because the Commission is now asking for feedback, let's first of all think about not continue to support the already people that have the money. So when you see a lot of support schemes, what we see is that in Portugal was the same. You can apply for 3,000 euros of support of buying an electric vehicle, but it's an online process with the form. So basically only people that have access to the internet, that are well off, they are not info excluded can access. And also the maximum amount of the vehicle to purchase was 62,000 euros, which is more or less the price of a Tesla. So we are basically paying people to buy a Tesla that they could afford anyway.
Yeah, with the subsidy, it remains a car of like 50,000 K. So it's not the budget that regular people just have laying around and that they can spend on a car.
Yeah. And the region of Brussels also, they were quite concerned about this because of the company cars that you mentioned. I think Belgium is one of the countries, if not the country in Europe with the biggest, and these vehicles are usually big. So they are now very much concerned. They came in a recent meeting with them of the size of these vehicles. So they are saying, okay, the government is just giving money for people to bring their big cars to our city, and now we have to deal with this, and we are struggling. So it's indeed something that needs to be addressed, how to design these incentives in a way that actually targets the people that need, and in a way that fits the city's needs also.
Exactly.
Indeed. Quite a complex story indeed. Okay, are there any other questions from participants maybe?
Sharing.
No, not for now. Then I would propose we move on to the final presentation of today. My colleague Elke Francois. She's a resident of Leuven. She lives in a low-traffic street, and she has requested a charging point in her street. I believe it's installed by now. And she just wants to share her personal story as a citizen and how she felt about the procedure, the process of having such a charging point installed in her street. So not a lot of figures or numbers or rules and regulations this presentation, but a bit of a light ending. So there you go, Elke.
Thank you. I hope you can see my presentation already.
Yes.
All right, perfect. So indeed, no numbers, no figures. I will just share my personal story, and I want to start with the fact that I just live in a typical house in a row in the city of Leuven, and these are the pictures of my streets. I want to share with you the challenges that this has, this street and this house, to be an owner of an electric car. We do live in a residential area with a lot of, or with some challenges on parking because there's not a lot of parking spaces in these streets. But this pressure on parking has been lowered or has been decreased because of the fact of the introduction, of this blue zone that the city of Leuven has introduced there, so that people have to put their disc, I don't know if it's the correct English term for this, when they want to park in the streets, and residents can buy this fee for 60 euros per year parking cards to park their car in the streets. This introduction has reduced the pressure on parking in my streets and in the neighborhood as such, but also the introduction of the mobility plan, the circulation plan, with a lot less cars in my streets, has also reduced this pressure on parking, which is quite important to explain the situation in my streets a bit. So again, focusing on my house. So this is my house here, a typical house in the row with no private parking garage or lot or space available. But we wanted to really have this electric car, and I have to say I'm one of that typical persons in Belgium with a husband being available to have this company car. Sorry for that. Otherwise, we also weren't able to buy this electric car. It's just because of the fact that we could, thanks to the job of my husband. We have chosen to have this car also because of the fact that in the end, within 300 meters, there was already a charging point available to charge this electric car, because we are not able to have this private charging point at our home. So this was really an important fact to choose for this electric car, that there was indeed, so the chicken and egg discussion is really important indeed, because there was already this charging point available. And therefore we have chosen for this car. And we saw 3 years ago when we started to have this car that the pressure on this charging points was getting higher and higher and higher. So more and more people are having an electric car in my neighborhood. So a year ago or something, it was like this. We found out that it was sometimes impossible to find or to charge our car because there was always cars charging over there. So we requested, we had to put our request at the Flemish government to have an additional charging points in the neighborhoods. And we met all the conditions to ask for this extra charging point, so we did. This was checked by the Flemish government, I think, and then the city of Leuven also checked this if we fully meet all the conditions that they are having. And then the city decides, okay, this is good to go, and they added an extra charging point. I think they request the provider to do this, and they provide, of course, the signs and the indication on the grounds so that it's only there for charging your electric car. It went pretty smooth, pretty fast, I have to say. So we didn't have to wait that long for this. We were happy. We see that now this charging point is used a lot. So there was definitely a need. But on the other hand, it also felt a bit not so good, because now we know that we have a bigger impact on the parking pressure in our streets. So there's those 2 spots that are only there for these electric cars of these rich people that can afford these electric cars. So it feels a bit, not so nice. And also I also have these issues with all the things that Pedro and has been talking about, does a city really have to dedicate these parking spots in low car zones, because that's the whole idea in a residential area? Do we want to attract extra cars? Does it need to be that these public spaces are dedicated for only these electric cars? It feels a bit weird, and I'm also thinking that it should be invested, or there should be invested more in this fast charging points, and not in this slow charging more. But on the other hand, this fast charging is more expensive. So challenges, a lot of challenges, but this is just my personal story, my personal experience. It went smooth, I have to say. I'm very happy, but there are still some questions, things that we are not pretty sure of if this is the right way forward for this. So voilà, this was my personal story.
Thank you, Elke, for briefly sharing that with us. It's quite interesting to hear a mobility professional like yourself talk about these internal struggles you have. You want to move to electric, you don't want to claim the space in your low traffic street just for your car, but there's no other solution in the end. So that's really interesting to see and to hear that these struggles are real and they are present in citizens' minds. So thank you for this. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
So we've come to the end of this webinar, so I'd like to open the floor to any questions there are from the audience about Pedro's, Rosanne's, or Elke's story. If there are no questions, I gathered some of the questions you submitted via the registration form, so maybe we can have a look at those as well. Just share my screen again. Elke, could you let me know if someone puts up his hand or puts something in the chat? Because I can see it right now. Normally you're able to see these questions. I just translated them into English because most of them were submitted in either Dutch or French. I've put beneath which city or where did the question come from. So a first question that I gathered: to guarantee the efficient use of charging points, how many public charging points should there be in relation to the number of on-street parking spots? I think Pedro, you already talked about this, and Rosanne as well, especially when you talked, Pedro, about the installed capacity in different EU countries, and that too much infrastructure, like in maybe Germany, France, or the Netherlands, might not be as efficient. Could you elaborate some more on that maybe, or?
Yes, of course. Okay, at the moment, they are complying, but what we see also, given the future prognosis of the number of electric vehicles, they will have to accelerate the deployment, because now there's more than enough capacity, but if you look in 2030 or 2035, there's not going to be the case. In relation to the specific question, how many? Well, there's no easy answer for this. It will depend, of course, on as Rosanne mentioned, on the urban policy, on the parking policy, on where the city wants these chargers to be. Because if the city, like Leuven, for example, is focusing more on off-street charging because they want less cars, so there's no point in implementing a very dense network of chargers.
Sure.
Because this will completely hijack the mobility policy, let's say. And Elke also mentioned this, so she feels guilty. I've been talking with the city of Leuven, with Tim Asperges, and it's two things that for him is like, we want to communicate better to citizens how we can use electric mobility in a way that it improves people's lives. But there's always this okay, there's individual electric mobility and shared electric mobility, and it's really hard for the city to get the right tone on trying to get the buy-in from the citizens. But also, as you mentioned, so this is kind of, okay, you have the charger and the parking, and if the parking is dedicated for electric vehicles only, basically we are privatizing public space, and the cities are concerned. So how do we make sure that we get some of the profits or some of the revenues from these operations? Otherwise, it's just it's seen as unfair for other commercial activities or even for the citizens. But yeah, responding to the question, it will depend on the policy of the city itself. It will depend on the current and future demand. There's no magic number here. It's mostly, I think, at the beginning by trial and error.
Yeah, sure.
So you learn that you have, but for this, the cities, it's fundamental. The cities that have access to the data of the usage of the charging point, even if they are privately operated, it's important that the cities have access to data to better understand and forecast the requirements.
No, understood. Thank you very much. Rosanne, is there anything you would like to add about this, or?
No, indeed, I agree. It's very situation specific. Yeah, I don't think it's a good idea to put numbers on this, because there's no one size fits all here. It's indeed very situation specific, and I think it's well, on one side trial and error, but on the other side, it's very important to investigate the situation up front and not just start to randomly place charging points, because it attracts traffic. So if you don't want to install charging points in places where you don't want to have a lot of cars. So it really requires careful planning.
Okay, thank you.
There's
I think someone
question.
raised his hands indeed. Yeah, so thank you. The floor is yours, Stefan, I believe.
Yes. Well, the question came from me.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Yeah. What I actually was curious about is at a certain point it becomes inefficient to put more charging stations on the street. Let's just like simplify it, and let's say like every charging point can like how can service 10 cars. Then is it just a simple formula that you don't want to you just have 10% maximum of the charger of the on-street parking spots that are a charging point? Because some politicians in Ghent, I hear noises that they want 1 in 4 of every parking spot to be a charging point. And I mean, in my opinion, this becomes an inefficient use, like Pedro says, of the charging points. And I was just wondering, is there already some study about that or some rules about that? Because like spatially and also technically, it's not obvious to put charging stations in the streets, especially in Ghent. Like we want a more sustainable street with green and space. So, I mean, the charging stations aren't really like a future-proof. I mean, how do I say? They don't. I mean, urban planners, they don't really want to see charging stations in the street. They want to plan around it and not. Yeah.
If I may, there's a study for the Brussels region that's being conducted by VUB for the predictive model to define where the charging locations will be. And I think it kind of responds to that. So let's make this in an efficient way. They are not going with a maximum number at the moment. They are not trying to go for a specific number. They are first trying to see what are the needs. Might be helpful. I can maybe share the contact of the person that's working on this, or maybe so the person, it's Neil Sargent from this Brussels region. The commission, what they did was to look at the fleet, not at the parking places. So that's why there's the sunset clause. So they say up until 15% of the vehicles are electric, we have this minimum power output. You decide where you put it. But after 15%, there's no need for us to keep pushing for accelerated, because the things will start becoming organically developed. So the operators will know, they will know best where best to install, and if they need more charging points or not. Because when it comes to finding specific metrics, it's really hard. I can give an example. We are working at the Sustainable Transport Forum on accessible and inclusive charging infrastructure. So basically not just about the charger itself, the height of the screen to be accessible for persons in wheelchairs, but also the weight of the cables and the space around. So the parking space has to be a bit bigger if you want to navigate with a wheelchair. And initially the commission was asking us, you need to define a percentage. Which percentage of the places should be accessible? 1 in 4, 1 in 3, 15%. And we are more and more convinced that it's not possible, because it depends on the local. So France, for example, now they have regulations for this, and they say it starts from 30% and reduces from 10% as the number of parking places grows. So they say less than 10 parking places, 30% with a minimum of 1, and then more than 200 is like 5 or 10% of these places must be accessible. But this is defined at the regional level. So what happens is that if one municipality of that region has all the necessary accessible parking places, then the other municipalities don't need to do anything, because as the region as a whole, they are complying. So this creates perverse incentives. When we try to define a very strict number, that is not kind of looked at a local level, at a very high level. So these are just two examples. I can maybe share with Merton the contacts of the people from Brussels that are working on this model. They might be a useful contact for you to maybe reach out to understand what they are doing and how and why they are doing that approach, and to see if they can get any different conclusions.
That's fine, Pedro. You can just pass them on to me, and I'll pass them on to Stefan, so we can have a look at that, see if it's of interest to him. Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
No problem at all. Let's see if we can have another question, because we still have some time. And the second question I received comes from Kamnik in Slovenia. How can enough charging points be made available for everyone, especially in urban areas where many apartment buildings don't have any charging infrastructure at all? I think we already saw some of the solutions people come up with to deal with this challenge, both informally, let's say, by making creative solutions themselves, and formally as well, by participating, like the city of Mechelen, in projects to innovate around the type of charging points you can install. But I don't know if there's a direct answer to this question. How can it be made available sufficiently? That also depends on the amount of electric vehicles that will be bought over the next few years or decades. I don't know, Rosanne, Pedro, if someone of you has an answer to this.
I can maybe give my input. So do we want to have charging points available for everyone, or do we want less cars? I've seen cities like Amsterdam, and there's for example, where initiatives such as energy communities, for example, can play a role, especially if you don't have parking garages. So you can have a local renewable production shared by the community that can, for example, also charge 1 or 2 shared vehicles among the whole neighborhood. So this is there's initiatives like this being developed in several cities in Europe. It reduces the number of the cars, but it allows, okay, if you need a car, you have an available car. It's not just your car. You share with other residents, and might be a solution for some specific cases. Because I would say that again, if you have the one-to-one replacement between ICE cars and electric vehicles, there will not be enough space
True.
to provide charging.
And like connecting to Rosanne's story, accessibility and ownership are not the same. You don't have to own a car to access one. So that's a big distinction, I believe, that's important as well.
Exactly, and there the car sharing scheme has an important role to play. We see that nowadays it's mainly used by people from high income categories. So there are still challenges to be overcome. We have to analyze why this is the case. That it's probably still a cost issue, that it's not more widely used by people who want to use electric vehicles but cannot afford the purchase price. But there is indeed an important role to play, especially in urban areas, for car sharing schemes. In more rural areas, those car sharing schemes are less ideal, of course, as a solution, but there you have less of the problem with that there is restricted space.
Yeah, speaking from personal experience, like when I go to friends or family who live in the Kempe, a more rural part of Belgium, even apartment buildings there often have like garage boxes or a driveway. And in Antwerp, where I live personally, that's not the case. So there are these regional local differences indeed. Thank you for that answer. I see Yuri, another colleague of mine who's also here in the chat, has raised his hand. Go ahead, Yuri.
Yes. Hi. Yeah, maybe it's been dealt with, but this whole discussion about does everyone need access to a charging point nearby? Is there a clear vision on this where we're heading to? Because it kind of seems to me that we want gasoline stations in every single street. That seems what we are aiming for at the moment. How about the balance between fast charging points? Do we really need all those charging points in the city, or is it a temporary measure? And are we aiming for sort of status quo in the future, how it was done nowadays with the gasoline stations? So, is there a clear ambition on this towards the future, thinking about all the accessibility problems in our streets, the width of our streets, for me, it's not clear what we are aiming for on this topic.
Pedro, might depend again on like the local policies each city or municipality has. Maybe that will be really big in this.
But I agree with Yuri. I think there's a strong push for electrification. There's a strong push from the industry to purchase electric vehicles, big electric vehicles, expensive electric vehicles. And then there's a strong push by charge point operators. Of course, it's their business models. And we are seeing now, it started with a very large group of companies. And now what we see is the big ones, that are already operators of gas stations, like Total, in Endesa or others, that are now taking over. And they already have the customers, they already have the know-how, they already have kind of a business models, and they will try to replicate that business model. I would say in a city, we have to have a balance approach between fast charger for the top up, so you just charge 15 minutes and you continue. So you don't have the car parked there but for residential areas, we still have to have slow charger for overnight charging, also because the grid capacity will not be able to deal if everyone starts fast charging. Also, it's not good for the vehicles in the long run if you only use fast charging. So the cars are not. I remember when we purchased our first in Almada, so in a previous incarnation, so we bought some Renault Kangoo's electric vehicles, and we bought a charger, and we thought about, okay, let's buy a 22 kilowatt charger, but the vehicle only charges up to 7.4 kilowatts, so it would be a waste of capacity. And a lot of the vehicles are still limited in this regard. But it's a bit concerning, and a lot of the discussions that we have at the European level is that indeed the way is not clear. There was this group created by Commissioner Thierry Breton from DG Grow, so the big industry, the internal market, called Route 35. It was the idea was to create this expert group to prepare Europe to be ready for the 2035 phase out of internal combustion engines. And they discuss a lot of things, a lot of indicators like the number of chargers, the affordability of the vehicles, the jobs. What happens to European industry? Are we losing our factories to China? What happens to the legacy industry? And then there was POLIS and the Eurocities were there, and you mentioned our Secretary Generals, but what about thinking about less cars to reduce the need for such charging, to reduce the need? And there was a bit of silence, and we were not invited anymore for any other meetings. So it's
Okay.
indeed a very lobbying
Mhm.
activity at the moment, and it might not reflect the interest of the cities when it comes to the final decisions.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's check. I have two more questions, I believe. The first question here on my screen is it the government's responsibility to provide charging infrastructure? Petrol stations are currently private companies. So will private players expand charging capacity in the future or take it over completely? This was put to me by someone from Putte here in Belgium.
I think this is a very, very good and relevant question because I would initially be inclined to say, well, this is up to private players, but then on the other hand, obviously you get this purely demand-driven model where you will have areas where there will be no charging opportunity, and there obviously you can also have no EV uptake. So it's a bit of a it's a bit of the same discussion as will you leave public transportation completely open in the hands of private operators? No, you want to have at least some oversight, some steering body that makes sure that there's also the opportunity for people who want to have an electric car but do not have the opportunity to charge to have access to a charging station. So I think especially in the initial stage, it's better that it's coordinated by government.
Maybe to avoid profit maximizing as the main incentive and add accessibility as one of the aspects to take into account.
If I may, just to expand a bit, because I think Rosanne mentioned this very well. So responded to the question very well. Just to say that as a recommendation for local authorities, when you do when you do your tenders and procurement for charging infrastructure, indeed take into consideration this, what Rosanne said, that you need to ensure a balance, the territorial balance and accessibility for everyone. So when the cities, it's important for them to have a little bit of control of where the chargers are located, even if it means having a mix of filet mignon and bones. But it's just a matter of how you design the tender to ensure that the operator that wins the tender, or the operators, will have to install chargers in the most profitable areas, but also service areas that might not be as profitable, but will have to be covered anyway.
That connects well to the last question here on the screen as well. Where should these charging stations or fast charging stations with multiple charging slots be implemented? That also depends probably. You mentioned that in the beginning of your presentation, Pedro, when you talked about these corridors, 10T and comprehensive network, that there are different rules and regulations.
I would say there's place for them, of course, along the main highways, because this is actually where they are needed. Fast charging in cities, I see them, for example, to service captive fleets, taxis, ride hailing, because so in parking and charging plazas for these fleets, this is probably where they make most sense. If we're talking about charging stations with multiple charging slots, because then they can serve several vehicles at the same time. There's also an interesting initiative in the Netherlands, in the Gelderland region, which is about clean energy hubs. So they have charging hubs for different technologies, hydrogen, electricity, but also natural gas, biomethane, outside of the city. So what they say is that so we want this charger at the regional level to want the vehicles, especially the big ones. We don't want them to enter the city. So create infrastructure outside of the city with some amenities like coffee, areas for resting. It's like a highway petrol station, but for different alternative fuels, precisely to reduce the number of vehicles that enter the urban environment. So I would say a mix probably along the corridor is important, but also to serve specific aspects and specific fleets. These fast charging plazas should be located in cities in very strategic places.
Thank you very much. Are there any other additions, questions, remarks? Because we are nearing the end of our time and just watch the clock. If not, then I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. We'll send the presentations to everyone who participated here today, as well as the recording of this webinar, so you can share it with colleagues or with partners who might find it of interest. And hopefully we'll see each other again during other CVNet.be activities this year, or in Karlsruhe maybe, at the POLIS conference. And well, have a good time, everyone. Have a nice day, and thank you all for joining today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice
Bye.
day.